Hello Year 10 Trilogy students, it's me Miss Alford again, and it's our lesson 2 of Adaptations and Ecosystems. You will need either the notebook that you had before that you did our first lesson in, or just some more paper, and preferably 2 coloured pens again. So our driving question for today is, how do living things survive together? So if you think about it, some living things like to live together, some things don't. So we need to have a look at how these interactions occur and why they're important and what the implications are of those. So make a note of your driving question and write down the 3 keywords for today. We've got ecosystem, interdependence, and competition. Pause the video if you need a minute to write those down. So that first keyword, what is an ecosystem? So basically an ecosystem is anything that's alive and not alive in a sort of environment that interact together all the time. So if you imagine a living thing such as a bunny rabbit interacting with maybe the weather and the non-living part of its environment. So you can think about it in lots of different ways, but I do need you to remember though that plants are living things. Lots of people forget that a little bit in this topic. So you can see it's a picture here, this ecosystem. You can see that despite things being in different circles, if you look at the big red circle, the whole ecosystem, that everything actually relies on various different things in order to be able to survive. So for example, those trees on the left, they require the solar radiation, the light source from the sun, in order to be able to photosynthesize. And then you've got is it a bunny rabbit? Yeah. And the sort of bottom of the tree there, that obviously requires those plants because it needs a bit of shelter, maybe needs the food as well. So you can see how actually the bunny rabbit is relying on the sunlight as well. So what do organisms need in order to be able to survive and reproduce? So when we say organisms, we're talking about any living thing. So that's plants and animals as well. I want you to have a moment, think to yourself, pause the video. What does any living thing, maybe break it down into animals and plants if that's easier for you. What do they need in order to be able to survive, but also reproduce? So some different things you might have come up with in your little list. You might have come up with food, fairly obvious one, probably something you're thinking about right now. Mates, and I don't mean your mates sort of as friends. I'm talking in terms of finding an opposite gender in order to be able to reproduce. So for example, an antelope will need to find the opposite gender in order to be able to reproduce and make a baby antelope. Territory needs its space in order to be able to actually kind of find its food, find its mates as well. Shelter, somewhere to hide, somewhere to raise its young potentially. Water, very important for any living thing. Light, probably not so important for animals, but obviously we need light for the animals that are reliant on plants for food. Space, so a plant doesn't necessarily need territory, it doesn't need to sort of mark its boundaries, it will just physically need space in order to be able to grow. Mineral ions, we get those mainly from our food, but plants, for example, don't get food, they absorb mineral ions from the soil. So those top ones you might have noticed are more related to animals, and then these bottom ones are more related towards plants. There is the overlap of water there though, which probably come under both. But you maybe have come up with some other things, or maybe use slightly different vocabulary than I did for that's basically the same thing. But I want you to have a think about where do most of these things come from. So an animal, I want you to have a think about an animal and any animal at all, but where is it most likely to be able to get its food from? Pause the video to have a little think if you need to. So an animal is likely to get its food from eating other animals. So maybe it is a hunting animal and it's got prey that it will hunt and then eat. Or alternatively, it could eat plants, or a bit of both, like we do. And this is what we call interdependence, another one of our keywords today. So interdependence is that kind of reliance on other things within a community. So we're relying on something else alive in order to be able to help it survive or reproduce. So not only do we need the food to be able to survive in terms of just getting energy and all those nutrients we need, We need the energy in order to be able to reproduce. It's quite energy sapping growing children and that sort of thing, and then feeding them as well. So can you think of any other examples of interdependence within a community? So not just food, but how else might an organism rely on another organism within its community? Pause the video and have a think. There's loads of different examples. Some of you maybe came up with something like an owl needing a tree to live in, to build its nest. You maybe thought of something like a mushroom that needed something to die in order to be able to feed off of its remains. You might be thinking of polar bears needing seals, for example, in order to be able to feed, like different types of feeding. Loads of different things, but mainly it's that the interdependence is fulfilling one of these different requirements. So it either helps with food, mates, territory, shelter, water, light, space, or mineral iron. If it doesn't really help with one of those things, it's probably a bit of a waste of time. So, instability. So when things aren't quite kind of going as they should, if you've got one species that maybe gets removed, maybe gets wiped out by a disease or something, perhaps it became extinct, all the other organisms within that community maybe sort of either directly or indirectly rely on that organism that has been removed or species that has been removed. So I want you to think about, what do you think could, other than maybe disease, what could cause what might happen if one of those species is removed? Everything within that community would be affected too. Not just one thing, maybe not the thing that eats it perhaps or gets eaten by it. Everything, there would be like a big knock-on effect, like a ripple effect if you like. And the best way of looking at that is using a food web. So I've got a really simple food web here, sort of a woodland. And if you look, you can see there's lots of different interdependence going on there. Mainly, we're only talking about food here, but there's obviously other types of interdependence going on in terms of shelter, etc. too. But if we talk just about these grasshoppers, because the grasshoppers have got quite a few arrows coming on to it and off of it. So remembering that the arrow direction shows the flow of the energy. So for example, the energy from the grain goes into the grasshopper and the energy from the grasshopper goes into the owl as things get consumed. So I just think about what would happen if a pesticide wiped out all the grasshoppers in this habitat. So the grasshoppers get wiped out. Can you pause the video and list down all the different things that you think might happen if grasshoppers no longer existed in that food web? So here's a few that I came up with. There would be less food for owls and birds, quite obviously. The owls would need to eat more mice because at the moment, before the grasshoppers get wiped out, you've got both grasshoppers and mice being eaten by the owls. But as soon as there's no grasshoppers, the owls still need the same amount of energy as before. So the mice will have to kind of like make up that deficit. And therefore, because the birds don't have a food source at all, with any other food source either, sorry, as the grasshoppers, more grains will get eaten by those birds, but then that's going to have a knock-on effect on the mice, because the mice also eat the grains. So things could start getting a little bit awkward for the mice in particular. If there's less mice, because the number of grains gets reduced, the number of owls will therefore be reduced because there's no other food source for them to eat. So that like right-hand side is quite difficult, really. But if we go over to the left-hand side, you've got the grass isn't being eaten by the grasshopper anymore. So rabbits will be able to eat more of it. So probably they will end up with more bunny rabbits. And if there's more rabbits, then there might be more food for the foxes as well. So the number of foxes will increase, which will mean that they will probably want to eat more birds. And then there's another kind of cyclical effect there on the right-hand side of that food web being affected again. So you can see now, just by one species, and this is only talking about food, we're not talking about anything else that is required by these organisms, one species getting affected will affect the entire food web. Maybe not immediately, maybe not directly, but indirectly and as a bit of a knock-on or ripple effect, will definitely have an impact. So this stability or interdependence that doesn't get sort of attacked in any way is really important. So a stable community is when the species and the environmental factors are in a kind of balance. So nothing gets massively increased or decreased too rapidly, so that everything else is able to stay fairly constant. So we're looking for the numbers of species to stay within a sort of narrowish range. I'm not saying they'll stay exactly the same, as one thing dies, the other thing, something else is born. You need to, there's a sort of narrow range of population that you would kind of expect to see. So you can see this in what we call predator-prey cycles. So if you look at this graph, we've got moose and wolves in one area or one habitat. And you can see over the time, over the years, over 10 years there, the number of moose and wolves changing. So if you have a look at how the data looks, can you basically link those two lines? And the question in the blue box is, why did the moose population decrease between 2002 and 2004? So pause the video, have a look, have a think, make a note if you need to. So you can see the moose is the dotted line, and they increase between 2000 and 2002. But it will get to the point where the moose will probably be such a high number that the wolves are able to feed more sort of successfully because they hunt the moose. So the wolves, you can see the more solid line is the wolves. They increase a little bit lower than the moose, which is important because as soon as the number of wolves goes above that sort of base number of moose, there's not going to be enough food for those wolves. So between 2002 and 2004, there's more wolves than the moose population is able to sort of sustain in terms of a food source. So you can then see after 2004 that the moose population drops, but so does the wolves quite dramatically because there's not enough food to be able to sustain them. So we get this kind of cycle happening, and then as the number of wolves drop, you can then see later on the moose is able to sort of pick itself back up again, and that's totally natural, and that kind of range is fine. If, however, the wolves was to increase so massively because maybe a new food source was introduced, not wiped out, but introduced, then the moose maybe would have problems there because they've eaten too much, and then you might see a massive decrease, which gets it down to a number where they can't actually reproduce at any point and get their numbers back up to a sustainable population. So predator-prey cycles give us an indication of basically how everything's getting on, how it's interacting with each other. Any huge changes that don't kind of follow each other is a bit of a cause for concern. So quick question, which of these is not an example of interdependence within a community? You need to be really careful with this. So we're looking at interdependence of organisms. So we've got, is it a rabbit using grass for food? B, a fox dispersing seeds from mistletoe on its paws? C, a disease wiping out all the fish in a pond? Or D, a robin nesting in an oak tree? Pause the video if you need to have a think. So the answer is actually C. It's C because it would affect the community, absolutely, but the description itself isn't indicating interdependence of species on the fish as a food source. So a disease could be a living thing, absolutely, but it's not talking about disease. The fish don't depend on the disease, and the disease doesn't really depend on the fish. So it's not really an interdependence. It's kind of just an effect that could cause a massive issue within a community. You're kind of looking for two living things that would affect each other, really, if you're looking for examples of interdependence. If you didn't get this right, by all means go back through this video, but I've also popped on the Show My Homework what's it called, entry for this lesson, a link to the BBC Bite Size link, which is about interdependence within communities. So do have a look through that before attempting the writing task or quiz if you didn't get that right, to give yourself a boost. So writing phase, get your pens ready, get your paper ready, and I'll give you some clues and stuff when I go through the questions, but make sure you write in full sentences, and then we'll go through those answers after you pause the video and give yourself some time to complete that. So for grades 1 to 2, you just need to tell me what an ecosystem is, basically, what is in it, what is not in it, and maybe give me an idea about what interdependence is. So I would start that with an ecosystem is. For grades 3 to 4, explain what things an organism needs in order to be able to survive and reproduce. So if you made some notes earlier of your thoughts, and that would be really helpful. So write down what any living thing needs in order to be able to live, and what it will also need in order to be able to make baby versions of itself. So for grades 5 to 6, explain how living things within a community depend on each other. So here's where you probably want to give me examples, things like how plants provide food and shelter, that sort of thing for animals. Maybe give me some specific examples if you can think of any. And then grades 7 to 9, explain the effect of the removal of a species from a community. So think about that food web, think about what happens if something was to be removed, what would happen to all the other organisms within that community. So pause the video, give yourself a decent sort of 15-20 minutes to write full sentences to answer each of those categories, to make sure we've answered our question of how do living things survive together. So hopefully you've managed to get as much of the written work done as you can. If you've got a green pen, great. If not, another colour would be fab. Tick and correct your work. Make sure your work is useful for you for in the future. There's no point in just putting a cross because you're not going to know what the correct answer is. So make sure you correct it if you've got it wrong. If you feel like something I give you, either by talking to you or in my answer written on the PowerPoint, you could give you a bit of extra detail, add it in as well, please. Always useful to have more than you think, well, more than the minimum, isn't it? So for question 1, or grades 1 to 2, you had to describe an ecosystem. So we're looking at the interaction of a community of living organisms with the non-living parts of their environment. So the interaction of the community of living organisms is how they interact together, so like shelter, food, etc. But also the non-living parts, so things like the sunlight providing the energy needed for the photosynthesis, and the water providing the habitat for the fish in the lake, for example. For grades 3 to 4, explain what things an organism needs in order to survive and reproduce. So you would need to say things for a plant and things for an animal, so light, space, mineral, ions, and water if it's a plant, and food, mates, and territory if it's an animal. You probably want to put water in the animal bit as well, but hopefully that's a bit self-explanatory, but pop it in if you need to. For grades 5 to 6, explaining how living things within a community depend on each other. We've got animals depend on other animals, and plants for food, and plants for shelter. Plants depend on animals to assist with pollination and seed dispersal. So I don't think I mentioned this in the video, I apologise, but if you think about if you've got a plant that needs to make sure the seed that it produces doesn't actually grow too close to itself because it still needs the space. Some animals, such as furry animals in particular, the seeds can sometimes be sticky or have kind of like little sort of spiky bits, I suppose, that will stick to the animal's fur, and then they are able to move away from the original plant, and then the seed actually disperses somewhere else and falls off the animal's fur, and then it can grow where there's a bit more space. Same sort of thing for pollination, which is basically the sort of pollen being taken to the other plant to be able to fertilise it, and then the seeds produce. But that tends to be done more by insects rather than animals, like large animals that you probably consider. So that's known as interdependence. So getting that keyword in there is really important. For grade 7 to 9, explaining the effect of the removal of a species from a community. So we were talking about a food web. So if one species gets removed from the community, everything will be affected as well within that community. So, for example, other food sources might need to be found and used, and therefore those numbers go so low those organisms can't reproduce anymore, so those numbers decline beyond repair. Great sentence there. And if that is the sole food source for one animal, then they won't be able to survive. However, obviously, if they've got another one, then that will obviously be sort of maxed out, if you like. So a huge impact could be had. You can go into way more detail than that for grades 7 to 9. You could even come up with an example food web or use one we did earlier together, which would be really good. So today I achieved, and remember you need to use describe, explain, use or combine. So today I achieved use because I could explain how living things within a community depend on each other, for example. So pause the video if you need to write in your background. Don't forget, you've got the 10-question quiz. Please don't complete the lesson, then forget to do that. It's really useful so that I can see where we're at, how we're getting on with everything. And don't forget that I do believe Mr. Radmore is emailing parents' scores home so that your parents can see how you're getting on. I don't know, but I've emailed Show My Homework because there was a problem with 2 of my questions on this particular topic. There should be an image with questions 9 and 10. I might attach it as another sort of picture just so you've got it in case it's not there. But I think it's supposed to be a food web basically that you're supposed to answer 2 questions on, and it for some reason won't seem to show. So if it's not showing when you do the first round through, open up the attachment and have a look at that to help you with questions 9 and 10. But hopefully it'll be working and then it will all be okay. But yeah, I'll see you soon for lesson 3.